All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 30, Section 3, Vietnam, the Downward Spiral. So recall that American involvement in Vietnam had been going on really ever since World War II, but by the time that President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, 16,000 American troops were in Vietnam supporting South Vietnam, which was the anti-communist part of Vietnam. By 1968, American involvement in Vietnam had escalated to 500,000. This occurred under the presidency of Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ. And what allowed for this escalation was the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was passed by Congress, allowing the president to take all necessary measures to repel the communist threat in Vietnam. The turning point was the Tet Offensive, which was a massive attack by the North Vietnamese against the United States forces, which convinced most Americans that it was time to leave Vietnam. In fact, so much so that Johnson, who was responsible for much of the escalation in Vietnam, did not even run for office in the 1968 presidential election. Instead, we know who won in 1968 was Richard Nixon, who called for an ending or an American exit to Vietnam, but called it peace with honor, which meant the United States was simply not just going to pack its bags and leave, but it was going to find an exit strategy. All of this, or really what the Americans failed to do in Vietnam, was to win the hearts and minds, not just of people in Vietnam, but really around the world, and especially back home. A significant anti-war movement had formed during the Vietnam conflict, really unlike any other anti-war movement in American history. And so the failure to win the hearts and minds of people in the United States, people in Vietnam, and people around the world meant that the United States, or many people in the US, believed it was time to exit. Some of the weapons that were used in Vietnam included napalm. This is fire bomb. And one of the ways that the United States really failed to win the hearts and minds was, just some of the images. Vietnam was one of the first televised wars, and people in the US and around the world got a first-hand look of some of the brutality and carnage of the conflict and really came to call an end to it. Also, what turned people's hearts and minds against the United States were sometimes the massacres which occurred. The My Lai massacre in particular was when a number of Vietnamese civilians were killed by US forces. And what was worse was the effort at a cover-up. The only one held accountable for the My Lai massacre was Lieutenant William Calley of the United States. He served some prison time for it, but eventually had his sentence shortened down and was eventually able to make his way out of prison. So, these images of civilians being, hurt at the hands of US forces didn't really bode well, again, for the hearts and minds of the world. Back at home, things only kind of increased in terms of their escalation. Nixon called an ending to the war, but he wasn't anti-war, right? There's a difference. The anti-war movement, or the anti-war protesters, called for an immediate end to the Vietnam War and an end now. Nixon's strategy was actually in some ways to escalate the war, not by putting American boots off the ground, but by more aerial bombing. So this was, of course, not in line with what the anti-war movement sought. It meant expanding the war. Nixon expanded the war and bombings into Cambodia. Cambodia, if you're not familiar, it's a neighbor country to Vietnam. A lot of the Viet Cong fighters in South Vietnam were receiving supplies via Cambodia. Cambodia was a country which more or less, stayed out of the war. Nixon expanded bombing to take place in Cambodia, which did not bode well for the anti-war movement. Nixon's strategy was Vietnamization, that is to replace US troops with Vietnamese troops So the war would continue, but U.S. boots on the ground would leave. And so after 1968, this number of 500,000 was the apex. You know, I want to say maybe by 1969, I don't have the exact statistics, but you know, you may have had something around 100,000 U.S. troops there. And by 1973, when the United States really exited, it's down to sort of the 10,000s-ish area. So the peak was 1968 of American involvement in Vietnam. But Nixon's strategy to escalate bombings, expand the war into Cambodia, replace U.S. troops with Vietnamese troops was all part of his kind of peace with honor strategy that he had. Anti-war movements erupted at colleges, Kent and Jackson states. These were the sites of anti-war protests that turned deadly. Students were killed at both universities, Kent State and Jackson State, which was completely shocking for the rest of the nation. And, you know, pulling out of the quagmire, so to speak, again, you know, Nixon's effort was peace with honor, but one of the sticking points between the U.S. position and the North Vietnamese was the status of North Vietnamese troops. The question was, can they stay in the South? Right? That was the question, and that's really what the two sides couldn't agree upon. They also couldn't agree upon bombings, for example. The United States insisted that bombing missions continue to take place. The North Vietnamese refused to negotiate unless the bombings halted, so that was another sticking point. But it was made a little bit more, you know, the effort to find a way out, or at least the demands that the United States find a way out, was only made more urgent with the publication of the Pentagon Papers. This was top secret info about how the U.S. lied in Vietnam. And when this information became public about some of the lies, including the Gulf of Tonkin and other things that the U.S. government had done in conducting the war in Vietnam, when this was made public, it only fueled the demands that the United States find an exit. Daniel Ellsberg, he published the Pentagon Papers. So published Pentagon Papers. So he was responsible for releasing them. Maybe not, maybe it was published by the newspaper, maybe released. I'll just put Pentagon Papers here, release the Pentagon Papers. Finally, a peace agreement came in 1973, sort of a, you know, we might call it a ceasefire between the United States and North Vietnam on this question of whether or not North Vietnamese troops can stay in the South. According to this accord, the answer was yes, and this was a way for the United States to get out of Vietnam. However, the United States also made a pledge that if the war were to resume, the United States has the right to re-intervene in Vietnam on behalf of the South. This essentially had created two Vietnams, one in the North, one in the South. The North was the one held by Ho Chi Minh and the communists, who I think is actually dead by this point. The South is held by the pro-US or anti-communist forces. But in 1973, you really saw American involvement in Vietnam dwindle down to that number that we talked about here. You know, by 1975, down to kind of the 10,000s. Not too many Americans that were still there. However, 2 years later, 1975, the North attacks South Vietnam. And the United States is kind of left with this decision. Does it re-intervene? Does it go back into Vietnam now that the North is aggressing again? And it was decided in 1975 the U.S. would not intervene in Vietnam. The U.S. capital there in Vietnam was captured in 1975 by North Vietnamese and communist forces. It was renamed Ho Chi Minh City in honor of Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese nationalist/communist. South Vietnamese ceased to exist, and Vietnam became not only an independent, but also a unified communist nation. What were the consequences of Vietnam? Well, on top of the life, you had approximately 58,000 Americans that were killed, perhaps 1.5 million Vietnamese that were killed in the entire conflict, dating back to original American involvement. It was incredibly costly, including pensions for Vietnam veterans, not only fighting in that war overseas, but it took away from programs like the Great Society at home. So The cost of life in Vietnam was great. The cost in terms of money was great, but also really changed American perceptions. Vietnam really caused the United States to reevaluate its limits. There was sort of this unending optimism about the ability of the United States really to do everything all the time in every part of the world. Vietnam kind of put limits on American influence and American involvement around the world. Americans came to question not only should America involve itself around the world, can America evolve itself around the world, and is America always doing good when it involves itself around the world? These were outlooks about America's role in the world that really did not exist during World War II. World War II was a much more clear case of good versus bad. America emerged triumphant. America should involve itself in conflicts around the world. Vietnam sort of caused the United States to recalibrate its standing in the globe.